You know, history has its fair share of infamous outlaws, but very few have ever reached the almost mythical status of this one man from Colombia. He wasn't just some brutal drug lord. For a time, he was one of the wealthiest men on the entire planet, with a fortune so massive it could challenge the power of whole countries. So today, let's unpack the absolutely unbelievable rise and fall of Pablo Escobar.
To really wrap your head around Escobar's power, you've got to start with the money. By the late 1980s, his personal fortune was estimated at an incredible $25 billion. That made him the seventh richest person on Earth. But let this sink in. His wealth was almost two-thirds of his entire country's GDP. He wasn't just rich, he was basically a nation-state all by himself.
So, where did all that money come from? Well, he got it by dominating a single, illegal industry with absolute ruthlessness. At his peak, Escobar's Medellín Cartel supplied a staggering 80% of the world's cocaine. Think about that for a second. If someone was using that drug anywhere in the world during the 80s, there was an 80% chance it came from him.
Now, holding on to that kind of control required a brutally simple philosophy, one he offered to pretty much everyone, from police officers to politicians: Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. It was a very clear choice. You could take his bribe and get rich, or you could take his bullet and die. It was that combination of corruption and pure terror that he used to build his entire empire.
So how does a person even go from a pretty modest background to becoming the world's most infamous narco-terrorist? Well, his story kicks off with this desperate, all-consuming ambition for wealth.
And this wasn't just some pipe dream. It was a vow he made to himself, this incredibly intense promise that fueled his every single move. This obsession is what pushed him into the criminal underworld, because he was convinced that money was the only real source of power. And his climb was just shockingly fast and violent. He started out with petty crimes, but by 1971, he'd already escalated to kidnapping and murder. Just a few years after that, he murdered a rival trafficker and just seized control of the entire Medellin drug trade. By 1976, he had brought all the city's major players together to form the infamous Medellin Cartel, with him, of course, right at the very top.
With the cartel established, Escobar's life entered a whole new phase. This was his time as king, and it was defined by wealth you can't even imagine, a surprising move into politics, and this bizarrely contradictory public image.
And here it is. This is the central paradox of Pablo Escobar. On one hand, to the poor of Medellin, he was a savior, a Robin Hood figure who built them homes, hospitals, and soccer fields. But on the other hand, to the Colombian government and his enemies, he was a terrorist, responsible for the deaths of thousands. We're talking judges, politicians, and over 600 police officers.
The sheer volume of cash he had created problems you just can't make up. He spent thousands of dollars a month just on rubber bands to hold the stacks together. He literally lost billions, with a B, every year because rats would eat the cash he'd stashed in warehouses. And famously, while he was on the run, he burned $2 million in a bonfire just to keep his daughter from getting cold.
Driven by this desire for ultimate power, and of course, immunity from prosecution, Escobar actually fulfilled a childhood dream and got himself elected to the Colombian parliament. For a brief moment, the biggest criminal in the country was also one of its lawmakers. He even served as an official government representative in Spain. Eventually, the government kind of cornered him, but Escobar cut a deal. He said he'd surrender, but only if he could build his own prison. The result was La Catedral, which was basically a luxury resort with a bar, a soccer field, and guards that he personally handpicked. And from inside this so-called prison, his cocaine empire just kept on running without skipping a beat. But, this outrageous setup couldn't last forever. After Escobar tortured and murdered two of his own men inside La Catedral, the government finally decided, okay, we're moving him to a real prison. Escobar's response? He just walked out, sparking what would become the largest manhunt in history.
So what was the one thing this guy, who seemed to fear nothing, was truly afraid of? Extradition. He knew his Plata o Plomo tactics wouldn't work in an American courtroom. He once said he'd rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the U.S. And this fear is what drove him to wage a full-scale war against his own country.
This time, his enemies all united, an unprecedented coalition formed with one single goal: take down Pablo Escobar. You had the Colombian government, the U.S. DEA, his rivals in the Cali cartel, and even a new, shadowy vigilante group called Los Pepes, a death squad made up of people whose families he had destroyed.
After a year and a half on the run, it all came down to a single, fatal mistake. On his 44th birthday, he got sentimental and stayed on the phone with his family for just a little too long. American and Colombian intelligence teams used that call to trace his exact location. The very next day, they raided the house.
The world's most wanted man was cornered. His death marked the end of an era for sure, but it left behind a complicated and deeply divided legacy.
As authorities stormed the building, Escobar and his bodyguards scrambled out onto an adjoining rooftop. And in the shootout that followed, the king of cocaine, the man who once offered to pay off Colombia's entire national debt, was shot and killed. So what is his legacy? Was he a messiah to the poor, a modern-day Robin Hood, or was he a devil who plunged his country into an absolute nightmare of terror and violence? Decades later, that's the very question Colombia is still wrestling with.
And if you want to understand that paradox, look no farther than this final number, 25,000. That's how many people, many of them the very poor he had helped, showed up for his funeral to mourn the man they saw as their savior. And that fact, right there, perfectly captures the complicated, unbelievable story of Pablo Escobar.